When Prince William agreed to visit the New Hope shelter in Edinburgh as part of his royal duties, he never expected to find his old university roommate among the residents. What began as a shocking reunion would spark a journey that would change both men's lives forever, revealing a long-held secret about their shared past and transforming how Britain addresses homelessness. Prince William stepped out of the black Range Rover and took a deep breath. The salty air of St. Andrews hit him right away. It smelled like his youth. "Welcome back, Your Royal Highness," said Professor Collins, waiting at the entrance to the university quad. "It's been too long." William smiled and shook the professor's hand. "It feels like just yesterday I was rushing to your class with a coffee in hand." The spring sunshine warmed the old stone buildings of St. Andrews University. Students walked by, some taking quick glances at the prince. Most tried to act normal, but a few stopped to snap photos with their phones. The students still have exams to worry about, just like in your day, Professor Collins said with a laugh. William nodded. Some things never change. As they walked through the quad, memories flooded back. This was where he had lived as just Will. Not a prince, not the future king, just a young man trying to find his way. These halls had given him 4 years of almost normal life. St. Salvator's Hall looks exactly the same, William said, pointing to the building where he had lived as a first-year student back in 2001. My old room was right up there, 3rd floor. We've kept a small plaque on the door. Hope you don't mind, Professor Collins said. William laughed. I feel sorry for whoever lives there now. Extra pressure on keeping it tidy, I imagine. They continued walking. Students were sitting on the grass, reading books or chatting with friends. It was on a lawn just like this where he had first noticed Kate in that famous fashion show. She had walked out in a see-through dress, and he had turned to his friend and whispered, "Wow." Now she was his wife and the mother of his children. Life was funny that way. The Geography building has had some updates since your time, Professor Collins said as they passed the department where William had earned his degree. Though I'm sure you'd still recognize the lecture hall where you fell asleep that one time. William groaned. You remember that? I had been up all night finishing a paper. Of course I remember. It's not every day a prince snores in your class. They both laughed. This was why William loved coming back. People here knew him as a person, not just a royal. A woman in a dark suit approached them. It was Emma, William's aide for the day. Your Royal Highness, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we should review the schedule for the remainder of the day, she said, holding out a tablet. Of course, Emma. Professor, would you excuse me for a moment? Certainly. I'll check that everything is ready for your speech. William looked at the tablet. The schedule showed his alumni speech at noon, lunch with faculty at 1:30, a quick tour of the new library wing at 3 Bow, and then, what's this last item? Visit to New Hope Shelter in Edinburgh? I don't remember that being on the plan, William said, frowning slightly. Emma nodded. It was added yesterday, sir. One of the shelter's patrons is a significant donor to your Royal Foundation. They made a special request. It would be a brief visit, 30 minutes maximum. William considered this. His day was already full, and Edinburgh was an hour's drive from St. Andrews. What kind of shelter is it? It's a homeless shelter, sir. They provide beds for about 50 people each night and offer various support services. William thought for a moment. Homelessness was an issue close to his heart. His mother, Princess Diana, had often taken him and Harry to shelters when they were boys. Those visits had left a deep mark on him. All right, we'll make it work. But we might need to cut the library tour short. I'll arrange it, sir. As Emma walked away to make the changes, William looked back at St. Salvator's Hall. He thought about his roommates from those days. There had been 4 of them sharing a flat in their second year, before he moved to a private cottage with friends. What? Were their names again? There was Michael, who was now a lawyer in London. They still exchanged Christmas cards. And Thomas, who had gone into banking. William had attended his wedding a few years ago, and then there was James Cooper, the Scottish boy with the guitar who always made everyone laugh. William smiled at the memory of James teaching him Scottish slang and showing him pubs where the locals didn't make a fuss about having a prince in their midst. What had happened to James? They had lost touch after graduation in 2005. William made a mental note to ask his staff to look him up. It would be nice to reconnect. "Your Royal Highness? They're ready for you in the hall," Emma called. William nodded and straightened his tie. Time to be the prince again. But for a moment, walking these grounds, he had just been Will again. And it felt good. He took one last look at his old dormitory and walked toward the hall, ready to address the next generation of St. Andrews students, hoping they were making memories as good as his own. The speech went well. William spoke from the heart about his time at St. Andrews, and the students seemed to hang on his every word. After a lunch with faculty that ran longer than planned, William found himself in the back of his Range Rover, heading toward Edinburgh. Rain had started to fall, pattering against the windows. The green Scottish countryside rolled by, misty and beautiful. William loosened his tie and leaned back in his seat. "We should arrive at the New Hope shelter in about 45 minutes, sir," said Tom, his security officer, from the front seat. "Thank you, Tom," William replied. He turned to look out the window, watching raindrops race down the glass. The drive to Edinburgh gave William time to think. His mind drifted back to his university friends. He had kept in touch with some. Michael had become a top lawyer and had visited Kensington Palace last Christmas with his wife and children. Thomas was running his family's banking business now and had donated generously to the Royal Foundation. But then there were others he had lost track of, like James Cooper. James had been different from William's other friends. He was a local Scottish boy who had grown up near St. Andrews in a small fishing village. He played guitar and knew all the best local spots that tourists never found. He treated William like a normal person from day one. "Hey, you put your pants on one leg at a time, just like the rest of us," James had said during their first week of sharing a flat. "Royal or not, you still have to take out the trash when it's your turn." William smiled at the memory. James had been right, of course, and he had been one of the few people who had helped William feel normal during those early days at university. They, too, had spent countless nights in small pubs where James knew the owners, who would warn them if any reporters were snooping around. James had taught William to play the guitar, or tried to, anyway. William had never quite gotten the hang of it. The car passed through a small town, and William recognized it. "Tom, isn't this Anstruther?" "Yes, sir." "Would you like to stop?" William checked his watch. They were running a bit behind, but "just for a moment, if we can." The car pulled over near a small coffee shop right by the harbor. William remembered this place well. He and James used to ride their bikes here on weekends to study and drink coffee that was better than that fancy London stuff, as James used to say. "I'll just be 5 minutes," William told his security team as they set up a perimeter. He entered the coffee shop, which was mostly empty on this rainy afternoon. It looked almost the same. The wooden tables, the chalkboard menu, the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods. An older woman behind the counter did a double-take when she saw him. "Your Royal Highness," she said, giving a small curtsy. "What an honor." "Hello," William said warmly. "I used to come here as a student. Best coffee in Scotland, my friend James." always said. "James Cooper?" the woman asked, her eyes lighting up. "That boy practically lived here. Are you two still friends?" William felt a pang of guilt. "We lost touch after university. Do you know what happened to him?" The woman's smile faded slightly. "I heard he became a music teacher, but I haven't seen him in years. Such a talented boy with that guitar." William ordered a coffee to go, and as he waited, he looked at the photos on the wall. There, buried among pictures of fishing boats and local events, was a faded photograph of himself and James sitting at a corner table with books spread out between them. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low, trying to be incognito. "We don't tell people that's you," the woman said, following his gaze. "Figured you'd want your privacy kept." "Thank you," William said, genuinely touched. "May I ask how long ago James stopped coming in?" "Oh, must be 8 or 9 years now. Last I heard, he was in Edinburgh." Edinburgh, the same place William was headed now. What were the chances? Back in the car, sipping his coffee, William watched as they passed the beach, where he and James used to play impromptu rugby games with other students. Further down the coast was the cliff, where they had sometimes studied outdoors on sunny days. So, many memories. The landscape gradually changed as they approached Edinburgh. The countryside gave way to suburbs, then to the historic city itself, with Edinburgh Castle standing proud on its rocky perch. "Tom, do we know anything about this new Hope Shelter?" William asked. "It's relatively new, sir. Opened about 5 years ago. They help homeless people get back on their feet, provide beds, meals, job training, that sort of thing." William nodded. "And who runs it?" "A woman named Margaret Campbell, former social worker, very respected in the community." The car wound through Edinburgh's streets, moving from the nicer areas toward a part of town that had seen better days. The buildings here were still beautiful in that classic Edinburgh way, all stone and history, but many needed repairs. Some storefronts were empty, with "For Lease" signs in the windows. They turned onto a narrow street and pulled up in front of a 4-story brick building. A simple sign read, "New Hope Shelter." "We're here, sir," Tom said. William looked out at the shelter. Something about this place felt important, though he couldn't say why, as if something was waiting for him inside. "Let's not keep them waiting," William said, straightening his tie again as the security team prepared for his exit. He had no idea that beyond those brick walls, his past was about to collide with his present in a way that would change everything. A light drizzle had started to fall. As William stepped out of the car, his security team moved quickly, checking the area before giving him the nod to approach the shelter. A woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes waited at the entrance. "Your Royal Highness, welcome to New Hope. I'm Margaret Campbell, the director," she said, giving a small curtsy. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Campbell." "I apologize for the short notice," William replied, shaking her hand. "Not at all. We're honored you could fit us into your schedule. Please, come in out of the rain." William followed her inside, with his security team and Emma, his aide, close behind. The entrance hall was simple but clean. A bulletin board covered with job listings, support group schedules, and thank you notes hung on one wall. The wooden floor was worn but well polished. "We opened 5 years ago," Mrs. Campbell explained as she led them down a hallway. "We can house up to 50 people each night, and we serve about 100 meals a day." "Who do you mainly help?" William asked. "All sorts, sir. Many are working people who simply can't afford rent in the city anymore. Others have lost jobs or homes due to illness. Some struggle with mental health or addiction issues. We try to meet them wherever they are in their journey," William nodded. He had visited many shelters over the years, but each one had its own character and challenges. "This is our main living area," Mrs. Campbell said, as they entered a large room with sofas, chairs, and tables. Several people sat reading or talking, quietly. A few looked up as William entered, their eyes widening in recognition. "We try to make it feel like a home," Mrs. Campbell continued. "People need more than just a bed. They need dignity and community." William moved around the room, shaking hands and chatting with residents. A man named Dave showed William his sketch pad full of city scenes. An elderly woman named Mary told him she had once seen his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, during a royal visit to Edinburgh in the 1980s. "She waved right at me," Mary said proudly. "Never thought I'd meet her grandson in a place like this." "Life takes unexpected turns for all of us," William replied kindly. They moved on to the dining hall, where lunch was being served. The smell of vegetable soup and fresh bread filled the air. About 30 people sat at tables, eating and talking. "We serve 3 meals a day," Mrs. Campbell explained. "Our kitchen is run by volunteers, including some former residents who've gotten back on their feet." A young woman approached with a tray of tea. "Would you like some, Your Royal Highness?" "That would be lovely. Thank you," William said, accepting a cup. He sat down at one of the tables, gesturing for the residents to remain seated when they started to stand. "Please, don't let me interrupt your lunch. I'd like to hear more about New Hope, if you don't mind sharing." For the next 20 minutes, William listened as people shared their stories. A former factory worker named Paul had lost his job when the plant closed. A young woman named Sarah had fled an abusive relationship with nothing but the clothes on her back. An older man named Robert had been living on the streets for years before New Hope helped him apply for his pension benefits. "The hardest part isn't being poor," Robert told William. "It's feeling invisible. People walk by like you don't exist." William nodded. "That's what my mother used to say after her visits to shelters. She believed in seeing people, really seeing them." "Princess Diana," Robert said with a smile. "She was a good one." "Yes, she was," William agreed, feeling the familiar ache that came with memories of his mother. After lunch, Mrs. Campbell showed William the sleeping areas, neat rows of bunk beds separated by simple dividers for privacy. Then came the shower facilities, recently renovated thanks to a grant. "And this is our pride and joy," Mrs. Campbell said, as they entered another large room. "Our resource center." The room contained computers, bookshelves, and several staff members, helping residents. A woman was updating a resume. A young man was taking an online course. "We help with job applications, education, housing forms, medical referrals, whatever people need to move forward," Mrs. Campbell explained. "Last year, we helped 26 people find permanent housing and 34 secure steady employment." "That's impressive," William said. "What's your biggest challenge?" Mrs. Campbell sighed. "Funding, as always. And the increasing cost of housing in Edinburgh means more people need our help each year. We're always at capacity, with a waiting list." William made a mental note to have his foundation look into supporting New Hope. "We have one more area, if you have time," Mrs. Campbell said, checking her watch. "Our recreation room. Some of our residents have amazing talents." "Lead the way," William said. They walked down another hallway, passing a small garden visible through a window. William could hear music as they approached the recreation room, someone playing a guitar and singing softly. "That's our resident musician," Mrs. Campbell said with affection in her voice. "He gives lessons to some of the younger residents. Quite talented." The recreation room was cozy, with a TV area, a small library corner, and tables where people were playing chess and card games. In the far corner sat a man with his back to the door, guitar in hand, singing quietly to a small group of listeners. The song sounded familiar to William, an old Scottish folk tune that he had heard many times during his university days. He moved closer, drawn by the music and the memory it triggered. The singer had shaggy brown hair streaked with gray and wore a faded blue sweater. His fingers moved skillfully over the guitar strings as he finished the song. The small audience clapped, and he turned slightly to acknowledge them. That's when William saw his profile. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Despite the beard and the lines around his eyes, William would know that face anywhere. James Cooper, his university roommate, his friend, the person who had helped him navigate his early days at St. Andrews, the man whose photograph he had just seen on the coffee shop wall, now here, in a homeless shelter in Edinburgh. William stood frozen, unsure. What to do? Should he approach? Would James even want to see him after all these years? Before he could decide, James looked up. Their eyes met across the room. Recognition dawned on James's face. The guitar nearly slipped from his hands. "Will?" he said, barely, above a whisper. "Is that really you?" The room fell silent. All eyes moved between the prince and the man with the guitar. William found his voice at last. "James," he said, crossing the room with long strides. "I can't believe it's you." Mrs. Campbell looked between them, confusion clear on her face. "You know each other?" William nodded, his eyes never leaving James's face. "We were roommates at university, old friends." James stood slowly, setting his guitar carefully against the wall. He looked thinner than William remembered, more weathered, but his eyes still held the same warmth. "It's been a long time, Your Royal Highness," James said, a hint of his old smile appearing. "Too long," William replied. "Far too long." For a moment, no one moved. The shelter residents and staff watched in stunned silence as Prince William stood, face to face with James Cooper. Even William's security team seemed unsure what to do. It was James who broke the tension. "Well, don't just stand there like a royal statue," he said with a hint of his old humor. "Give us a proper hello, then." William laughed and stepped forward, pulling James into a hug. 20 years fell away in an instant. "I can't believe it," William said as they stepped apart. "I was just thinking about you today. We passed through Anstruther on the way here, and I stopped at that coffee shop we used to visit." "The Harbour Cup," James nodded, his eyes crinkling. "Best coffee in Scotland." "That's exactly what I told them you always said." Mrs. Campbell cleared her throat gently. "Perhaps you two would like some privacy to catch up. You could use the counseling room. It's empty right now." "That would be great, thank you," William said. He turned to Emma and his security team. "Could you give us a few minutes?" Emma checked her watch. 20 minutes, sir, if we're to stay on schedule." "Make it 30, William said firmly. This was too important to rush. Mrs. Campbell led them to a small room with comfortable chairs and a window overlooking the garden. "I'll bring you some tea," she said, closing the door behind her. Alone at last, the two men studied each other. James ran a hand through his graying hair, suddenly self-conscious. "I'd have cleaned up a bit if I'd known royalty was dropping by," he joked. "You look good, James," William said sincerely. "The beard suits you." "A gray beard to match my gray life," James replied with a small shrug. "But what about you?" 3. Kids now, is it? I see the photos in the papers sometimes." 3, William confirmed. "George, Charlotte, and Louis. They keep us busy." "And the lovely Kate? She's doing well?" "She is. She sends her best," William said, though of course Kate had no idea about this unexpected reunion. A silence fell between them. Not uncomfortable, but heavy with unasked questions. William noticed the calluses on James's fingertips, evidence that he still played guitar regularly. He also noticed the worn sweater, the tired lines around his friend's eyes. "James, what happened?" he finally asked. "How did you end up here?" James sighed and looked out the window. "It's a long story." "I've got 30 minutes, William said. "Start at the beginning." Mrs. Campbell brought in a tray with tea and biscuits, then quietly left them alone again. James poured them each a cup, his hands steady despite everything. "After university, things were good for a while," James began. "I got a job teaching music at a school in Glasgow. Met a wonderful woman named Fiona. We got married, had a beautiful little girl named Lily." James pulled out his wallet and showed William a photo of a small girl with bright eyes and her father's smile. "She's lovely," William said. "She was," James replied softly, and William felt his heart sink at the past tense. James took a deep breath. "When Lily was 6, she started getting sick. What we thought was just the flu didn't go away. The doctors eventually diagnosed her with a rare type of leukemia." William felt a chill. As a father himself, he couldn't imagine the fear. "We tried everything," James continued. "The NHS covered most of the treatments, but there was an experimental procedure in the States that showed promise. Insurance wouldn't cover it, so we spent every penny we had. Sold our house, moved in with Fiona's parents, worked extra jobs." James paused to sip his tea. "It didn't work. Lily died just after her 8th birthday." "James, I'm so sorry," William said, reaching out to put a hand on his friend's arm. "After that, everything fell apart. Fiona and the grief was too much. We couldn't help each other through it. She moved to London to live with her sister, and I stayed in Glasgow. I kept teaching for a while, but I wasn't really there, you know? The school was patient. But eventually, they had to let me go." Outside the window, the rain had stopped. A ray of sunshine broke through the clouds, illuminating the small garden. I stayed with friends for a while, then cheap hotels when I wore out my welcome. The money from selling my car lasted a few months. Then it was park benches, doorways, until I found New Hope 3 months ago. "And your guitar?" William asked, nodding toward the instrument they could see through the window, still propped against the wall in the recreation room. James smiled for the first time since beginning his story. "The one thing I refuse to sell. It's the same one. From university. Do you remember?" "Of course I do," William said. "You tried to teach me how to play Wonderwall, and I was absolutely hopeless." They both laughed at the memory. "Mrs. Campbell lets me give lessons to some of the kids who come through with their parents," James said. "And sometimes I play at a pub down the street for a few pounds and a meal. It's not much, but it helps." William shook his head. "James, why didn't you reach out? I could have helped." James looked down at his tea. "Pride, I suppose. And after losing touch for so many years, it didn't seem right to appear only when I needed something." He gave a small shrug. "Besides, what would I say? Hello, Your Royal Highness. Remember me? I'm homeless now. Could you spare a palace?" William couldn't help but laugh. James still had his sense of humor, despite everything. "Well, I'm here. Now," William said firmly. "And I want to help." James opened his mouth to respond, but a knock at the door interrupted them. Emma poked her head in. "I'm sorry, sir, but we really should be going. The press is gathering outside." "Press?" William frowned. "How did they know I'm here?" Emma looked uncomfortable. Someone posted on social media that you were visiting the shelter. It's been picked up by several news outlets. I'll be out in a minute, William said. Emma nodded and closed the door. You should go, James said. I don't want to cause any trouble. William stood, reluctant to end their conversation. This isn't over, James. I want to continue this. Can I come back tomorrow? James looked surprised. You'd do that? Of course I would. We have 20 years to catch up on. A smile spread across James's tired face. I'd like that, he said. I'll be here. Not like I have a busy social calendar these days. William took out his phone. Give me your number, so I can reach you directly. I don't have a phone anymore, James admitted, but Mrs. Campbell will know where to find me. William nodded, making a mental note to fix that situation immediately. Tomorrow, then. As they walked back to the main room, William felt a surge of determination. His old friend needed help, and he was in a position to provide it. He just had to figure out the best way to do so without embarrassing James or creating a media circus. What he didn't know was that the media circus had already begun. As William and his team prepared to leave New Hope Shelter, Mrs. Campbell approached with a worried look on her face. Your Royal Highness, there are quite a few reporters gathering outside. I'm not sure how they found out you were here. William glanced at James, who stood awkwardly nearby. Is there a back exit we could use? Of course, Mrs. Campbell nodded. Through the kitchen. William turned to James. Will you walk with me? I'd like to hear more about what you've been doing all these years. James hesitated. I'm not sure I should be seen with you. The papers will have a field day. Let them, William said firmly. I haven't seen my old friend in 20 years. I'm not sneaking away now. As they walked through the kitchen, staff and volunteers stopped to stare. William noticed how James greeted each person by name. Despite being a resident rather than staff, he clearly had become part of the shelter's community. So you were teaching music before? William began, not wanting to say, before everything fell apart. James nodded. For about 10 years, I loved it. Taught at a primary school in Glasgow. The kids were brilliant, eager to learn, full of energy. They reached a small door that led to an alley behind the shelter. William's security team went out first to ensure it was clear. All safe, sir, Tom reported. The car is waiting at the end of the alley. William turned to James. Come with me. We can talk more in the car. James looked surprised. Are you sure? Absolutely. Once they were settled in the Range Rover, William instructed his driver to take the long way back to the palace where he was staying. He wanted as much time as possible with James. Tell me more about your daughter, William said gently. James's face softened. Lily was amazing, smart as a whip and kind to everyone. She had my love of music, could play piano better at 8 than I can now. He smiled at the memory. Even when she was sick, she wanted to practice, said it made her feel normal. William thought of his own children, trying to imagine the unimaginable. When did she get sick? It started with bruises that wouldn't heal, then fevers and fatigue. The doctors thought it was just a virus at first. By the time they diagnosed the leukemia, it was already aggressive. James looked out the window at the Edinburgh streets passing by. The next 2 years were a blur of hospitals, treatments, hope, despair, more treatments, more hope. His voice trailed off. William waited patiently. The worst part was feeling so helpless. James continued. Your child is suffering, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Fiona and I spent every penny we had on treatments. We sold our house and moved in with her parents. Friends organized fundraisers. I picked up extra work playing music at pubs and restaurants on weekends. That's why we lost touch, William realized. You were fighting for your daughter. James nodded. There wasn't time for anything else. Old friendships, hobbies, sleep. Everything took a back seat to Lily's treatment. The car turned onto Princes Street, Edinburgh's main thoroughfare. Outside, people walked along, shopping bags in hand, living their normal lives. William wondered how many of them had experienced the kind of pain James described. After Lily died, James continued, Fiona and I tried to support each other, but we were both drowning in grief. She blamed the doctors. I blamed myself for not finding the money for treatment sooner. We fought about things that didn't matter. One day, she said she couldn't look at me anymore because I reminded her too much of Lily. We had the same eyes, you see. I'm so sorry, James, William said, feeling the inadequacy of his words. Fiona moved to London, and I stayed in Glasgow. I kept teaching for a while, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. The principal was understanding, but eventually, she had to think of the students. They deserved a teacher who could be fully present. So you lost your job too, William said. I did. And without a job, I couldn't afford my flat. I stayed with friends for a while, but there's only so long you can sleep on someone's couch before it gets uncomfortable for everyone. I picked up odd jobs, construction, bartending, whatever I could find. But nothing stuck. James rubbed his hand over his beard. Depression is a strange thing. You know you should be doing certain things, looking for work, paying bills, taking care of yourself. But it's like there's a wall between knowing and doing. I just couldn't climb over that wall. William thought about the mental health initiatives he and Kate had worked on over the years. They had heard similar stories many times, but never from someone he knew personally. How did you end up in Edinburgh? William asked. I had a cousin here who said I could stay with him while I got back on my feet. That lasted about 3 months, before his girlfriend moved in and needed my room. By then, I was out of money again. I spent a few nights on the streets, which was educational. The way James said educational told William everything he needed to know. Then, an outreach worker told me about New Hope. They had a program for people who were newly homeless, caught them before they got too used to street life. I've been there 3 months now. They're helping me apply for housing benefits, looking for music teaching jobs. And the guitar? William asked. James smiled. That old thing has been with me through everything. When I was really desperate, I pawned it a few times, but I always found a way to get it back. Mrs. Campbell lets me teach lessons to some of the kids at the shelter. It's not much, but it helps me feel useful. William thought for a moment. James, I want to help. Not just with money, but with whatever you need to get back on your feet. I appreciate that, Will, but I'm not looking for a handout, James said, using William's old nickname naturally. I've accepted help from the shelter because they offer it to everyone, not just because I happen to know someone important. It's not a handout, William insisted. It's a friend helping a friend, the same way you helped me all those years ago. The car pulled up to the palace gates. William could see his staff waiting for him, looking concerned about his delayed return. Come inside, William said. We can continue talking. James looked at the grand building, then down at his worn clothes. I'm not exactly dressed for the palace. Nonsense. I've seen you in much worse. Remember that Halloween when you dressed? As a zombie bagpiper? James laughed for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. I'd forgotten about that. You were so embarrassed to be seen with me. I was not, William protested with a smile. I was impressed by your commitment to the role. As they got out of the car, a staff member hurried over. Your Royal Highness, there's been a development. The press has gotten wind of your visit to the shelter. They're asking questions about Mr. Cooper. William felt a surge of protectiveness. How do they know his name already? Social media, sir. Someone at the shelter posted a photo. It's spreading quickly. James looked alarmed. What are they saying? The staff member hesitated. They're calling it a royal reunion with homeless friend. Several outlets are asking for interviews with Mr. Cooper. William turned to James. You don't have to talk. To them. You don't have to do anything you don't want to. James ran a hand through his hair. This is exactly what I was afraid of. We'll handle it, William assured him. But right now, let's get inside and have a proper meal. We can figure out the rest later. As they walked into the palace, William knew things were about to get complicated. The media loved stories like this. The prince and the pauper. Old. Friends reunited by chance. But what they didn't understand was that this wasn't just a heartwarming story for the evening news. This was James's life, and William was determined to protect his friend's dignity, while finding a way to help him rebuild. What he didn't yet realize was how much James would end up helping him in return. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. William woke to find Emma waiting with a stack of newspapers, all featuring the same story on their front pages. Prince and the Pauper. William's uni. Pal now homeless, screamed one headline. Royal roommates fall from grace, announced another. From St. Andrews to shelter. Prince William discovers old friend. Read a third. William flipped through the papers with growing anger. Most had used photos taken from social media. Grainy shots of him and James at the shelter. One had even found an old university photo of them together. This is ridiculous, William muttered. They're making it sound like some kind of fairy tale, not a man's real life. Emma nodded sympathetically. Your office has received over 50 media requests for comment, and twice that many for interviews with Mr. Cooper. Has anyone bothered James at the shelter? William asked, concerned. Security reports that several photographers were outside New Hope this morning. Mrs. Campbell asked them to leave private property. William's phone rang. It was Harry, calling from California. I see your old roommate made the news, Harry said when William answered. Are you okay? I'm fine, William replied. It's James I'm worried about. The media is treating this like some feel-good story, not a serious situation. That's what they do, Harry said. Remember when they found out about my friend who lost his leg in Afghanistan? They camped outside his hospital for days. I remember, William sighed. How do I protect James from this? You can't, not completely, Harry said frankly. But you can control your part of the story. Make a statement. Set boundaries. After talking with Harry, William called Kate. She had seen the news as well. Bring him to stay with us, she suggested. At least until the media loses interest, I'll offer, William said. But he's proud. He might not accept. When William arrived at New Hope later that morning, he found the situation worse than he'd feared. A crowd of reporters and photographers had gathered across the street, held back by police barriers. Inside, Mrs. Campbell looked frazzled. It's been chaos since dawn, she told William. We've had to disconnect the phones. Reporters keep calling, pretending to be family members of residents to get information. I'm so sorry, William said. This is my fault. Nonsense, Mrs. Campbell replied firmly. You didn't create this situation. Besides, there may be a silver lining. We've received more donation offers this morning than in the past 6 months. Where's James? William asked. In the staff room. He didn't want to be in the common areas where someone might take photos through the windows. James was sitting at a small table, drinking tea and looking at a newspaper. He looked up when William entered. "Your Royal Highness," he said with a wry smile. "I see I'm famous now." "I'm so sorry about this, James." James shrugged. "Not your fault. Though I must say, I don't appreciate them calling me fallen or a pauper. I've had some bad luck, that's all." William sat across from him. "I've come to take you away from all this. You can stay at the palace until the media loses interest." "That's kind. But no," James said firmly. "I'm not going to hide or run away. This is my life now, and I'm not ashamed of it." William was surprised. "But the reporters will eventually find something else to write about," James finished. "Besides, hiding at the palace would just make it a bigger story. Homeless man gets royal treatment. Can you imagine the headlines?" William had to admit James had a point. "There is something you can do, though," James continued. "Mrs. Campbell says the shelter has been getting calls from donors all morning. If this story helps places like New Hope, maybe it's worth the hassle." William thought about this. What if we controlled the narrative? Give one interview together to a journalist we trust. Tell the real story, not their sensationalized version. And talk about homelessness as a real issue, not just my personal drama? James looked interested. That might work. By afternoon, William's team had arranged an interview with a respected BBC journalist. They would film at the shelter the next day. The palace press office released a brief statement asking for privacy and respectful coverage. "Prince William is pleased to have reconnected with an old friend," the statement read. "He asks that the media respect Mr. Cooper's privacy during this time." Not everyone listened. That evening, a tabloid published an interview with a woman claiming to be James's ex-wife. She told dramatic stories about their marriage that James said were completely false. "That's not even Fiona," he told William when shown the article. "I don't know who that woman is." The palace legal team immediately demanded a retraction. William called James before bed to check on him. "How are you holding up?" "Better than expected," James replied. "A reporter offered me £5,000 for an exclusive. I told him no." "Good man," William said, "though that would have paid for a lot of rent." "Maybe," James said. "But some things are worth more than money." William thought about this after hanging up. James had lost almost everything, yet he maintained his dignity and principles. It was humbling. The next morning, as William prepared for the BBC interview, Emma brought more newspapers. The headlines had shifted slightly. "Homeless hero. The man who called Prince William roomy. Royal friendship stands test of time and tragedy." William shook his head. The media would always create their own story. But today, he and James would tell the true one. What he didn't know was that the interview would change far more than just the headlines. It would launch something neither of them had anticipated. The BBC interview aired the following evening. William and James sat side by side in the shelter's small library, talking honestly about their university friendship, the years they lost touch, and their unexpected reunion. "I never expected to end up here," James said on camera. "But life can change quickly for anyone. One health crisis, one job loss, that's all it takes." William spoke about how seeing his friend's situation had opened his eyes. "We think homelessness only happens to certain types of people. But James's story shows it can happen to anyone, even a university-educated teacher who did everything right." The interview ended with the journalist asking what would happen next. "I'm taking it one day at a time," James answered. "Besides, New Hope has been helping me apply for housing and look for teaching positions. "And I'll be supporting my friend however I can," William added, "just as he supported me during our university days." The response to the interview was immediate and overwhelming. Royal roommates started trending on social media. People shared their own stories of falling on hard times or reconnecting with old friends. But more importantly, William's phone began ringing with calls from housing experts, charity leaders, and government officials, all wanting to help or offer insights. "You've touched a nerve," Kate told him the next morning as they had breakfast. "People are really connecting with this story." William nodded, scrolling through the dozens of messages on his phone. "I need to do more than just help James. This is bigger than one person." "What are you thinking?" Kate asked. "I'm not sure yet, but I know who to ask." Later that day, William met James at a quiet cafe near the shelter. They had chosen a back room where they could talk privately. "The interview was good," James said as they sat down. "At least the reporters have stopped hiding in the bushes outside New Hope." "For now," William agreed. "But that's not why I wanted to meet. I've been thinking about what you said, about how quickly someone can go from stable to homeless. It happens more than people realize," James said, stirring his coffee. "At the shelter, I've met former business owners, nurses, even a lawyer. One health crisis, one job loss. That's what I want to talk about." William leaned forward. "I'm thinking of starting a new Royal Foundation initiative focused on homelessness prevention. And I'd like your help shaping it." James looked surprised. "My help? What do I know about royal charities?" "You know what it's like to fall through the cracks. You have insights I could never have." William pulled out a notebook. "I've been making some notes based on our conversations and my calls with experts." For the next hour, they discussed ideas. William wanted to create emergency funds for families facing medical crises or sudden job loss. James suggested affordable housing projects and better mental health support. "The hardest part, after Lily died, was feeling so alone," James explained. "If I'd had proper grief counseling right away, maybe things wouldn't have spiraled so badly." William wrote everything down. "What about job training? Is that helpful?" "It can be," James replied, "but there needs to be actual jobs at the end of it. And childcare, too. Many people at the shelter can't take jobs because they have nowhere for their kids to go." By the time they finished their second cup of coffee, William had filled several pages with notes. The outline of a comprehensive program was taking shape. "This is good," William said, looking over what they'd discussed. "Really good. Would you be willing to come to London next week to meet with my Royal Foundation team?" James hesitated. "Will, I appreciate the offer, but I can't just drop everything to become your homeless advisor." "Why not? You said yourself you're not working right now." "That's just it. I need to be looking for work, not flying off to London for meetings." William considered this. "What if the Royal Foundation hired you as a consultant? We'd pay you for your expertise." "You want to pay me to tell you about being homeless?" James raised an eyebrow. "I want to pay you for your insights and experience, both as someone who's experienced homelessness and as an educator." "This wouldn't be charity, James. It would be a job." James thought about it. "I'd need to discuss it with Mrs. Campbell. I've committed to teaching music to some of the kids at the shelter." "We could work around that," William assured him. "And this could lead to something more permanent." That evening, William called an emergency meeting with his Royal Foundation staff. He laid out his vision for what he was now calling Bridge Back, a program to help people bridge the gap between crisis and stability. "We need to move quickly," he told them. "I want to announce this within 2 weeks." His staff exchanged glances. "Sir, new initiatives usually take months to develop," one advisor said carefully. "Then we'll work overtime," William replied. "This is too important to wait." Over the next few days, William immersed himself in research about homelessness. He read reports, called experts, and visited other shelters. Each conversation reinforced what James had told him. Many people were just one crisis away from losing everything. Kate joined the project, bringing her expertise in early childhood development. "Many shelter residents are families with young children," she pointed out. "We need special support for them." A week later, James arrived in London for meetings at Kensington Palace. William met him at the train station personally, much to the surprise of other travelers. "You didn't have to pick me up," James said as they walked to the car. "I could have taken a taxi." "And miss seeing your face when you realize how much work I've created for you," William joked. At the palace, the Royal Foundation team presented their draft plans for Bridge Back. It would include emergency housing funds, mental health support, job training, and childcare assistance. They had identified potential locations for the first Bridge Back Center in Edinburgh. "What do you think?" William asked James after the presentation. "It's ambitious," James admitted, "but if anyone can make it happen, you can." That night, as they sat in William's study reviewing the day's meetings, James grew quiet. "What's on your mind?" William asked. "Just thinking about how strange life is," James replied. "A week ago, I was wondering how to pay for my next meal. Now I'm helping plan a royal initiative." William smiled. "That's the point of Bridge Back. Life can change quickly in both directions." As James prepared to return to Edinburgh the next day, William received surprising news. Several major business leaders, moved by the BBC interview, had pledged significant donations to the Royal Foundation specifically for homelessness initiatives. "They want to help build the first Bridge Back Center," Emma reported. "We're looking at over £5 million already." William shared the news with James at the train station. "It's happening faster than I expected," he told his friend. "We might be able to break ground in Edinburgh within months." "People want to help," James said. "They just need to be shown how." As the train pulled away, William felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. What had started as a chance reunion was becoming something that could help thousands of people, and it was all because he had recognized an old friend playing guitar in a corner of a homeless shelter. 3 weeks later, William stood at a podium in London, announcing the Bridge Back initiative to the world. Cameras flashed as he explained the program's goals. Bridge Back will create a safety net for those facing sudden crises, William told the gathered press. "We aim to provide emergency funds, temporary housing, job training, and mental health support to help people avoid homelessness before it starts." Behind him stood representatives from major banks, construction companies, and social service organizations. All had committed resources to the project. And to William's right stood James, dressed in a new suit, but still sporting his beard. "I'm also proud to announce that our first Bridge Back Center will open in Edinburgh later this year," William continued. "This center will provide temporary housing, job training facilities, and support services all under one roof." After the announcement, reporters shouted questions. "Is this just a reaction to finding your friend homeless?" one called out. William stepped back to the microphone. "It would be more accurate to say it's a response. My friend's situation opened my eyes to how quickly anyone can fall into hardship. But Bridge Back isn't about one person. It's about creating lasting change for thousands of people." "Mr. Cooper," another reporter called, "will you be working with the Royal Foundation permanently now?" James leaned toward the microphone. "I've agreed to serve as an advisor, sharing my experiences both as someone who has faced homelessness and as an educator. But more importantly, I'll be one of many voices in forming this initiative." the press conference ended, but the coverage continued for days. Most headlines were positive. Prince William launches ambitious homelessness initiative. Royal Foundation tackles housing crisis. But some royal watchers criticized William for getting so personally involved. The prince is letting emotions cloud his judgment, wrote one columnist. This level of personal involvement in a social issue crosses the line of royal neutrality. William tried not to let such criticism bother him. The evening after the announcement, he called James, who had returned to Edinburgh. "How are things at the shelter?" William asked. "Busy," James replied. "Your announcement has everyone talking. Mrs. Campbell says donation offers are pouring in." "And how are you doing with all the attention?" James chuckled. "It's strange. People at the shelter treat me differently now, like I'm special because I know you. I keep telling them I'm still the same person who washes dishes on Tuesdays." "Are you still planning to stay there until the Bridgeback Center opens?" "For now," James said. "But I have some news. A primary school in Edinburgh called about a music teaching position. I have an interview next week." "That's fantastic," William exclaimed. "Permanent position?" "Part-time to start, but it's a step back toward normal life." Over the next few months, William traveled between London and Edinburgh regularly, checking on Bridgeback's progress. Kate joined him on many visits, adding her ideas to the project. Construction began on the first Bridgeback Centre, a former office building near Edinburgh's city centre. Architects designed apartments, classrooms, and offices where people could get help with housing, jobs, and health services. James visited the construction site with William frequently, offering practical suggestions based on his experiences. He had started his teaching job, working 3 days a week with young children. "The kids keep me busy," he told William one day as they toured the half-finished center. "It feels good to be teaching again." As Bridgeback took shape, William invited James to speak at events, sharing his story to help others understand homelessness better. James was nervous at first, but soon found his voice. His honest words about loss, grief, and resilience moved audiences everywhere he spoke. "I never thought I'd become homeless," he told a group of business leaders. "I had a good job, a home, a family. Then life threw too many things at me at once, and I couldn't cope. That can happen to anyone." Donations poured in. Other cities asked about starting their own Bridgeback centers. Government officials began consulting with the Royal Foundation about homelessness policies. 6 months after their chance reunion, William visited James in Edinburgh again. This time, they met at a small apartment near the school where James taught. "Welcome to my new home," James said, opening the door to a modest but clean one-bedroom flat. "It's not much, but it's mine, or will be once I pay off the lease." "It's wonderful," William said sincerely, looking around the small space. James had few possessions, but his guitar had a place of honor on a stand by the window. Photos of Lily were displayed on a small shelf. "I have news," James said, as he made tea in the tiny kitchen. "I got a letter from Fiona yesterday." William raised his eyebrows. "Your ex-wife? What did she say?" "She saw me on TV talking about Bridgeback. Said she was proud of me." James smiled slightly. "We're going to meet for coffee next week, just to talk." "That's huge, James." "It might be nothing," James shrugged, "but it feels like another piece of my life coming back together." William shared his own family news. "George and Charlotte made drawings for you. They call you Uncle James now, after all my stories about university." James laughed. "Uncle James? I like that." Later that evening, they walked to the Bridgeback Center construction site. It was nearly complete, with residents expected to move in within weeks. James would be one of the first, with a job already waiting for him as a program coordinator and music teacher. As they stood looking at the building, a few people recognized them and waved. A woman approached with a young boy. "Excuse me," she said nervously. "Are you Mr. Cooper? My son has been taking your music class at school. He talks about you all the time." The boy smiled shyly up at James. "Hello, Mr. Cooper." "Hello, Ethan," James replied. "Are you practicing your piano?" "Every day," the boy said proudly. After they left, William smiled at his friend. "Looks like you're making a difference already." "One kid at a time," James said. "Just like you're helping one person at a time with Bridgeback." As they walked back through the city, William thought about how much had changed in 6 months. A chance meeting had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. And somewhere in the universe, William thought, Lily must be very proud of her dad. 6 months later, the first Bridgeback Center in Edinburgh was bustling with activity. The former office building had been transformed into a warm, welcoming space with apartments, classrooms, a cafeteria, and offices where people could get help with jobs, housing, and health services. William was visiting again, this time for the official 6-month celebration. He walked through the building, greeting residents and staff. Children played in a colorful corner designed by Kate, who had insisted that families needed child-friendly spaces. "Your Royal Highness," Mrs. Campbell greeted him warmly. She had joined Bridgeback as a senior advisor while still overseeing New Hope Shelter. "Are you looking for James? He's teaching a music class in room 3. William found the classroom and peeked through the window in the door. James stood at the front of the room, guitar in hand, leading a group of children and adults in a song. He looked healthy and confident. A far cry from the tired, bearded man William had discovered in the shelter a year ago. Not wanting to interrupt, William waited until the class ended. Students filed out, many stopping to chat with James before leaving. "You've become quite popular," William said, entering the room. James looked up with a smile. "Will, I didn't know you were coming until this afternoon." The two friends embraced. James had trimmed his beard and gotten a haircut. He wore a simple button-down shirt and jeans. Teacher clothes, not the worn sweater of his shelter days. "How are the classes going?" William asked, sitting on one of the child-sized chairs. "Better than I expected," James replied, putting his guitar in its case. "We have 12 regular students now. Some are residents, others come from the community. Music gives them something to look forward to." "And how's your apartment?" William asked. James had moved into one of the Bridgeback units when the center opened. "It feels like home now," James said. "Come see, I've made some improvements." They walked up to the 3rd floor, where James unlocked the door to his 1-bedroom apartment. It was small but bright, with large windows overlooking the city. James had added bookshelves filled with music books and novels. Photos of Lily were still displayed prominently, but now there were new pictures too. James with his students, James at the Bridgeback opening ceremony, James and William at a fundraising event. "I like what you've done with the place," William said. "It's amazing what a stable address and a steady paycheck can do," James replied. "Tea?" As James filled the kettle, William noticed a letter on the counter. James saw him looking at it. "That's from Fiona," he said. "We've been writing back and forth for a few months now." "How is she?" William asked carefully. "Better. She's working as a nurse in London. We've both done a lot of healing." James paused. "She's coming to visit next weekend." William's eyebrows shot up. "Really? That's huge, James." "It's just a visit," James cautioned. "We're not getting back together, or anything. But it's good to be talking again. We shared so much." Lily would want us to be friends, at least. They took their tea to the small balcony. Below them, Edinburgh spread out in its stone and slate beauty. In the distance, they could see Edinburgh Castle on its rocky perch. "I still can't believe how much has changed in a year," James said. "From sleeping on a shelter cot to this." He gestured at his apartment, then toward the building around them. "And not just for me. 28 people have found permanent housing through Bridgeback already. 15 have steady jobs." "Those are good numbers," William agreed. "The London Centre opens next month. Manchester after that. I heard you've been asked to talk about Bridgeback at the United Nations." William nodded. "They're interested in it as a model for other countries. Kate and I are going to New York in the spring." James took a sip of tea. "You know what's funny? The kids here don't care that I know a prince. They just want to learn guitar chords and sing Baby Shark." William laughed. "Speaking of kids, I have something for you from mine." He pulled out 3 folded papers from his jacket pocket. "Drawings for Uncle James." James carefully unfolded them. George had drawn a man with a guitar surrounded by musical notes. Charlotte had created a rainbow over a building labeled James House. Little Louis had contributed a page of colorful scribbles. "These are wonderful," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Please thank them for me." "You can thank them yourself when you come to London next month. Kate insists you stay with us for a night. The children want to meet their uncle." James looked surprised. "Stay at the palace?" "I don't know, Will." "No. Arguments?" "It's all arranged." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows over the city, they talked about future plans for Bridgeback. James had ideas for expanding the music program to include recording sessions for residents to share their stories. "Through song, music helped me when nothing else could," he explained. "It might help others find their voice too." William thought about how far they had come. A chance meeting in a shelter had led to a program now helping hundreds of people. But more importantly, it had restored his friend's life and given new purpose to his own work. As he was leaving, William noticed a small photo he hadn't seen before on James's bookshelf. It showed the two of them as university students, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at some forgotten joke. "Where did you find that?" William asked. "Mrs. Campbell found it in my things at the shelter," James said. "I didn't even remember having it." William studied the photo of their younger selves, before royal duties and personal tragedies had shaped them into the men they now were. "We should take a new one," he suggested. "Definitely," James agreed. "But not today. Today, let's just be grateful for how far we've come." And they were, both knowing the best was yet to come. 1 year to the day after William and James's chance reunion at New Hope Shelter, a special ceremony was held at the Edinburgh Bridgeback Centre. Government officials, charity leaders, donors, and residents gathered to celebrate the program's first anniversary. The main hall was decorated with photos showing the center's journey, from construction to completion, from the first residents moving in to current success stories. A large cake sat on a table decorated with blue and white flowers. William stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. James sat in the front row beside Mrs. Campbell and several Bridgeback residents. 1 year ago today, I visited a shelter in Edinburgh and found an old friend, William began. What started as a surprise reunion has grown into something that has changed hundreds of lives. He highlighted the program's accomplishments. 3 centers now open across the UK, over 200 people housed, job training for hundreds more, and partnerships with businesses that had led to steady employment for many Bridgeback participants. But numbers don't tell the whole story, William continued. The real success of Bridgeback lies in the individual journeys. The mother who can now provide a stable home for her children, the veteran who has found purpose through work, the young person who has returned to education. William gestured to James. I'd like to invite my friend James Cooper to join me. None of this would exist without him. James walked to the podium amid applause. He had become a familiar face to many, both through his work at Bridgeback and his advocacy for homelessness prevention. James has been the heart of this project from the beginning, William said. His insights, experiences, and compassion have shaped everything we've built. James thanked William and began speaking about the community that had formed at Bridgeback, how residents supported each other, how volunteers had become like family. As James spoke, William felt a wave of emotion. Here they were, a year later, celebrating something neither could have imagined during their tearful reunion in the shelter's recreation room. When James finished his remarks, William stepped back to the microphone. He had planned what he would say next carefully, consulting with both James and the Palace press office. Before we cut the cake, there's something I'd like to share, William said. Something about James and me that very few people know. The room grew quiet. Even the reporters who had been typing on phones stopped to listen. Everyone knows we were university roommates, William continued. But what they don't know is that during our second year at St. Andrews, I hit a very low point. William paused, taking a deep breath. The pressure of royal life, combined with still processing my mother's death, became overwhelming. One night, James found me in our flat, packing my things. I was planning to leave university, to walk away from it all. Murmurs rippled through the audience. This was a side of Prince William few had ever heard about. James didn't lecture me, or tell me what to do, William said. Instead, he sat with me all night. He played his guitar. He listened. He reminded me who I was beyond my title. And in the morning, I unpacked my bags. William looked directly at James, whose eyes had filled with tears. James saved me when I needed someone, William said, his voice strong and clear. He showed me kindness when I felt most alone. So when people ask why I've become so personally involved in this project, that's the real answer. I'm not just helping an old friend, I'm repaying a debt that can never truly be repaid. The room was completely silent now. Even the most seasoned reporters looked moved. Today, we're not just celebrating buildings or programs, William continued. We're celebrating the human connections that save us all. Because in the end, that's what truly bridges us back from our darkest moments. The hand of a friend, reaching out when we need it most. James stood and joined William at the podium. The two friends embraced as the room erupted in applause. Mrs. Campbell wiped tears from her eyes. Even the government officials looked touched. As they cut the cake together, cameras flashing around. Them, James leaned over to William. You didn't have to tell everyone that story, he whispered. Yes, I did, William replied. It's the truth. And it's time people knew that everyone needs help sometimes, even princes. Later, as the celebration continued around them, William and James stood by the wall of photos, looking at the newest edition. A framed picture of them on the day they reunited, alongside a photo taken just that morning. Past and present, side by side. What do you think happens next? James asked. William smiled. I think we keep building bridges, one person at a time. And that's exactly what they did. Thanks for joining me till the end. Let me know in the comments from where you are tuning in. Drop your city and country name in the comments. Also, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more heartwarming stories like Prince William's unexpected reunion. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button. See you in the next one.